Good day. 5th June today. We are roughly a year, we are a year from the start of Ukraine's summer offensive of 2023. To be precise, the summer offensive began on the 4th of June 2023 with a series of attacks by the Ukrainian military in the Vremivka salient area, and then a few days later, 3 days later, the main blow came with an advance by Ukrainian armored columns consisting principally of forces drawn from the 47th Mechanized Brigade seeking to storm the village of Rabotino, further west in the Zaporozhye area. Both of the attacks, the ones in the Vremivka salient and even more so the attack towards Rabotino, ended in disastrous failure. Film quickly appeared of burnt out tanks and armoured vehicles littering the Ukrainian battlefields, the Ukrainian steppes. The tanks, the armoured vehicles got caught in the immense minefields that the Russians had seeded right across the front lines. Russian helicopter gunships were busy destroying Western tanks and armoured vehicles operated by Ukraine. Russian artillery was also extremely forceful. And last but not least, right across the front lines, small groups of Russian infantry, obviously highly trained Russian infantry, equipped with anti-tank weapons, hunted and destroyed Ukrainian tanks and armored vehicles wherever they could. And this pattern of Ukraine trying to launch armored assaults towards the Russian front lines continued, if memory serves me rightly, for around 2 further weeks, Ukrainian losses being appalling throughout this fighting. And then the Ukrainian military commander, General Zaluzhny, supposedly informed President Zelensky that the offensive was not succeeding, and there are some claims that he actually called for the offensive to be called off, which of course President Zelensky did not agree to. And so General Zaluzhny, rather than call off the offensive, supposedly changed tactics. So from that moment onward, the Ukrainians advanced in small infantry groups, though tanks and armoured vehicles did continue to be used. They advanced through the minefields and towards the entrenched Russian positions on foot. And the result was even greater losses by the Ukrainians and minimal gains in consequence. Ukraine did achieve some progress in the Vremivka salient. They did capture a number of villages there. They pushed the Russians back, but they gained nothing of any consequence. And on the Zaporozhye front line, an advance towards the important town and very heavily fortified town of Tokmak behind the Russian lines was completely unsuccessful. The Ukrainians never reached Tokmak or came anywhere significantly close to it. In one place, near Verbovoye, they came close to the Russian heavy fortified lines, the Dragon's Teeth, the heavy big trenches, the ditches, the concrete bunkers, and all of that. But nowhere else were they able to break through the main line of the main area of control that the Russians had established ahead of their fortified lines. And even as all the attention of the world media was focused on the Ukrainian offensive in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, where the Ukrainians also, by the way, made attempts to advance along the east bank of the Dnieper River. There was big Ukrainian attacks for a tiny village called Piatichatki, which was fought over with intense ferocity, which the Ukrainians eventually claimed, of course, that they'd captured. It is there apparently largely deserted and completely ruined on the front lines. Still not yet under Russian control, though the Russians have been showing signs recently of wanting to regain control of it. But anyway, the Ukrainians were never able to push beyond Piatichatki in this area either. And again, they never reached the major fortified lines in this area also. But even as all this fighting was going on in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, Ukraine was launching an even bloodier and more costly offensive in the Bakhmut area. Its objective was to outflank Russian positions in Bakhmut, to capture the villages of Klashevka, Andreevka, then push on, capture another village, a bigger village called Kurdyumovka, reach the Russian supply lines into Bakhmut, cut those supply lines, and apparently, or supposedly, recover Bakhmut itself. Well, the fighting was, again, of an astonishing level of ferocity. Ukrainian losses in this area were horrendous. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, they were the heaviest losses of all that Ukraine suffered throughout the fighting in the summer. And again, the Ukrainians did recover some ground southwest of Bakhmut. They did reach Klashevka and they did occupy Andreevka, but in the end, they weren't able to push beyond those positions, and those gains were ephemeral. Klashevka and Andreevka have now been returned to Russian control, and the Russians, of course, have captured the other remaining villages close to Bakhmut, Khromovo and Ivanivska, Krasnoye as the Russians call it, and the Russians now have moved further west and are besieging Chasiv Yar. So all Ukraine's gains achieved at horrendous cost right across the front lines have been throughout their summer offensive proved ephemeral. Rabotino, once again, firmly under Russian control. The salient that the Ukrainians carved out between Rabotino and Verbovoye, Bradley Square, as it is sometimes called, that has been largely erased. Essentially, the front lines now are close to being where they were in the Zaporozhye area before the Ukrainian offensive began. The Russians now in the process of re-establishing full control of Staromayorsk in the Vremivka salient, likely that they have captured nearly all of this village. There's still fighting going on in Orozhaine, but again, most people expect that village also to be recaptured by the Russians in the Vremivka salient area. And as I said, all the Ukrainian gains have been ephemeral. Vast numbers of men and machines lost and destroyed, and basically nothing to show for it. It was a disaster. It was also something which, as I've said many, many times, no Ukrainian official, no Western official, no Western commentator that I have seen is prepared to acknowledge it was also a massive, catastrophic defeat. The Russians repelled the biggest offensive that the Ukrainian army has launched throughout the course of the war, almost certainly the biggest offensive the Ukrainians are ever going to launch at any point in the war, it is hardly conceivable that the Ukrainians will be able to launch another such similar offensive again. And that is a clear-cut Russian victory and a clear-cut Ukrainian defeat, and, by the way, Western defeat. And it is deeply depressing that no one at all on the Western side or the Ukrainian side appears willing to acknowledge that fact. Let me repeat again a point which I have made many times. Offensives don't just fail. They either end in victory or defeat. If one speaks of failure in war, then that is a defeat. It is not a mere failure. And in this case, Ukraine suffered a defeat, and it was a catastrophic one. Ukraine's summer offensive of 2023 then had a sad and tragic sequel, which is that over the course of the autumn of 2023, Ukraine appears to have sought to undertake some kind of offensive on the east bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region. An attempt was made by Ukrainian Marines to land on the east bank and to capture the village of Krinky. The Ukrainians rapidly became contained in this village of Krinky. A succession of articles, including articles appearing in the Western media, spoke about the catastrophic losses that the Ukrainian troops were suffering in Krinky, and eventually, a few months ago, the Russians stifled this bridgehead in Krinky, the ruins of which are once again in Russian control. And of course, these appalling losses as a result of these defeated offensives that the Ukrainians launched in the summer and autumn of 2023 provide the reasons why the Russians themselves were able to go onto the offensive almost immediately once these Ukrainian offensives had spent themselves. They went back on the offensive in October 2023. In December 2023, the important town of Marinka, close to Donetsk city, fell under Russian control. In February 2023, the even more important town of Avdiivka, one of the most heavily fortified positions held by Ukraine, close to Donetsk city, it too fell under Russian control. Since then, Ocheretino, a village of great strategic importance, has passed under Russian control. The Russians are continuing their offensive in all sorts of places. They've opened a new front in Kharkov region, and of course they have renewed their aerial offensive against Ukraine with missile strikes across the country, some of them targeting Ukraine's energy system. And there's an article today in the Financial Times which straightforwardly says that Ukrainians this winter must expect many days without electric power, without heating. This in a country where the winter temperatures can often fall below zero. Well, catastrophic offensives in 2023. And what is astonishing is that it looks like the appetite of Ukrainian leaders and of their Western backers for more Ukrainian offensives has still not been sated. Despite the disastrous results of last year's offensives, we're now hearing more talk again of further offensives by Ukraine despite the fact that by every calculus, Ukraine is far weaker now than it was a year ago, and Russia is far stronger now than it was a year ago. Specifically, the Ukrainians are now basically without an air force. Their air defense system has been smashed, probably beyond all hope of recovery. Their number of armored vehicles has disastrously reduced. Their number of guns, artillery pieces, is being reduced every day. Every day I read of further destruction by the Russians of more and more Ukrainian artillery systems, with the Kharkov area and the area around Krasnogorovka being the main areas where the Russians appear to be hunting and destroying artillery pieces in horrifying quantities. And of course, beyond that, we now have an extraordinary manpower crisis in the Ukrainian army, caused undoubtedly by the terrible losses that Ukraine has suffered over the last 2.5 years, with the worst of those losses almost certainly experienced over the course of those offensives which took place last year. And we've now had some rather interesting discussions about these losses. There's been an article in the Washington Post which tells us about how Ukrainian commanders are now finding that the troops that they're being sent from the reserves to fill out the units after the losses that have been incurred, that those troops arrive practically untrained. Basic training in Ukraine is barely covering the basics, commanders say. Ukrainian commanders in the field say they're bracing for most of the new troops under a new conscription law to arrive with poor training. And then we go on to read, Denis Yaroslavsky, commander of a reconnaissance battalion in Ukraine's 57th Brigade, entered the border town of Volchansk on May 2nd, accompanied by 4 battalions of exhausted troops, fresh from the battlefield in a different northeastern city. They soon realized their new positions were the first line of defense and that only 200 troops were already stationed in the town. When Russian forces pushed in just over a week later, he said, we lost almost the entire battalion. A battalion, in other words, 500 men lost, apparently in the first week of fighting in Volchansk. And we go on to read that the Ukrainian military are finding that the troops that they're being provided with to plug the gaps in the Ukrainian army are so lacking, even in the most basic training, that Ukrainian commanders have to spend the first 2 weeks or so trying to teach them the basics including how to handle guns. Well, this dismal reality doesn't seem to deter some people. I've been reading some really astonishing things about this terrible situation. This one being, for example, from the Institute for the Study of War. Ukrainian field commanders are reportedly compensating for training difficulties that mobilization has exacerbated by training new personnel on the front line. Ukrainian field commanders' decisions to train newly deployed personnel on the front before committing them to battle indicates that the overall quality of Ukrainian forces will likely remain higher than that of Russian forces in the near to mid-term. So the fact that the Ukrainian troops, the Ukrainian units on the front line are now receiving soldiers who are barely without any training at all, and that they have to be provided with some basic training on the front lines. I've seen 2 weeks training being suggested. Well, that's not a problem, because this training is apparently going to be even better, and it's actually going to ensure that those Ukrainian troops are better trained than the Russians, who are getting anywhere up to a year's training in proper training grounds deep inside Russia. This is what we're told by the Institute for the Study of War. I have to say, this comment from the Institute for the Study of War leaves me absolutely speechless. I just couldn't believe it when I read it, but there it is. And it remains the case that apparently Western media outlets and Western political leaders get much of their understanding of how the conflict is going from the Institute for the Study of War. I have to say that if I go back in time to the person I was 3 years ago before the fighting started, and remember myself then with almost no understanding of war and of fighting, I have a lot more today. Well, even then, if I'd read something like this, I would have thought it was, frankly, ridiculous. Not only ridiculous, but, by the way, inhuman. And, well, I think that to an even greater extent today. But anyway, despite all of that, despite the fact that the men are untrained, that there aren't many of them, because apparently what we're hearing is that the mobilization is not producing numbers of soldiers in anything like the number that Ukraine needs. Despite all of that, despite the shortages in artillery, in shells, in tanks, in machines, in aircraft, in air defense systems, despite all of that, Ukraine apparently must go on to the attack again. Now, I discussed, I think it was yesterday, a long program in Foreign Affairs, a long article, I believe it was in Foreign Affairs, which spoke about how Ukraine mustn't negotiate with Putin now, because negotiating with Putin at this time would be to negotiate with Putin from a position of weakness, and therefore Ukraine must somehow get through this year, go back on the attack in 2025, regain some of the ground, or most of the ground, that it's lost this year. And then maybe, just possibly, that might be the right moment for Ukraine to sit down and negotiate with Putin. I said that this was completely absurd, that it seemed to me utterly detached from reality. Well, perhaps the person who wrote that article is getting his ideas about the state of the war from the ISW. What can I say? But anyway, we've had that ridiculous proposal for a Ukrainian counteroffensive. But we're now hearing word about another Ukrainian counteroffensive, this time to take place over the next few weeks in the Kharkov region. And interestingly, we're getting it this time from a Russian source. Perhaps in some respects the most authoritative Russian source of all, which is Group of Forces Sever, or North, the group of forces which crossed the border in May, opened the new front in Kharkov region, captured a string of border villages, entered the town of Volchansk, where the fighting continues to be underway, and which is now besieging Lipsi. And Group of Forces North has a very interesting website, one which actually provides a surprising amount of information and commentary about the state of the fighting in the Kharkov region. Anyway, in their very latest report, they say that the fighting around Lipsi is stable, that the situation around Lipsi itself is stable, which is consistent with information that we have been getting from multiple sources. The Russians are not making an effort to advance in Lipsi, and the Ukrainians, for the moment at least, are not attacking in Lipsi. The Group of Forces North says, however, that there have been multiple counterattacks by the Ukrainians in Volchansk, that the Ukrainians have been making one attempt after another to reverse Russian gains. And the Group of Forces North says that all of these attacks have been repelled, and on the contrary, it is the Russians who continue to advance. And they claim, and there's no evidence to contradict them, they claim that in fact, over the last period of perhaps 24 hours, Russian troops in Volchansk have advanced by a further 500 meters. But Group of Forces North tells us something else. They have told us that the Ukrainians are preparing a counteroffensive in the Kharkov region, and that this counteroffensive will take place at some point within the next few days or weeks, and it's intended to happen before the next major week meeting of Western powers in July, and that its purpose again is to impress those Western powers with the successes that Ukraine is achieving on the battlefronts. And in fact, I would go further than this. I'm also going to suggest that one of the purposes of this counteroffensive, if it takes place, which I'm confident that it will, that one of its purposes will be to reassure the Western powers that the permission they have just given to the Ukrainians to launch cross-border strikes into Russia, that is actually having a real effect, that is making a difference, that with these attacks on Russian positions in Russia itself, Ukraine is not only able to stabilize the front lines, it is able to go on to the attack itself. And Group of Forces North then goes on to say that the Russians, that they're prepared for what the Ukrainians are going to do, and that they're ready for the Ukrainians, that when the Ukrainians come, they will be able to deal with them. There is a quality of let them come about this latest bulletin. And some people, Dima at the Military Summary Channel, I think correctly, is linking these major movements of Russian armored forces towards the border areas in Kharkov region, to all of this chatter and talk about a Ukrainian offensive. Now, to repeat again a point I have made several times now, the Russian troops that have been conducting operations in Kharkov region are regular Russian infantry drawn from the Russian army, line units of the Russian army. They are relatively light infantry operating on wheeled anti-armored personnel carriers. The heavy infantry, the infantry in the infantry fighting vehicles and supported by the tanks, of which, by the way, there are said to be around 400 in this area. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that was what the Ukrainians were claiming earlier before the Kharkov operation began. Anyway, these armored forces have not yet been committed to the battle. I've not seen pictures of a single Russian tank operating in the Kharkov region up to now. So the Russians are holding them back. What they're clearly doing is that they're grinding the Ukrainians down, exactly as I said yesterday. They're conducting a new type of operation. Kharkov meat grinder in Volchansk, less so in Lipsy. They're holding their positions, they're entrenching themselves in Volchansk. They're waiting for the Ukrainians to come. And given that we're Russians, we're talking about the Russians, they're almost certainly entrenching themselves, building trenches, laying minefields, doing all of the things that we've seen that the Russians know how to do in advance of whatever offensives the Ukrainians hurl at them. And I suspect that when the Ukrainian offensive comes, with this hodgepodge of units that Ukraine has assembled in the Kharkov area, the offensive will fail, just as all of the various counterattacks that Ukraine has been launching in the Kharkov area have also failed. The Russians will, in other words, defeat this counteroffensive, and then that will be the moment when the armoured fist that the Russians are assembling, the tanks, the infantry fighting vehicles, that will be the moment when they surge forward, when the Ukrainians have depleted their forces even further, are no longer in a position to withstand the Russians, and the Russians can just roll in and advance against far weaker opposition than the opposition that the Ukrainians have managed to put up till now. So I think this is how it's going to play out. This has been the story of all the various offensives that Ukraine has launched, including the two supposedly successful ones that Ukraine carried out in the autumn of 2022 in Kharkov region and in Kherson region. Those two offensives, like all of the others, unlike all of those, all of the others, did regain for Ukraine a significant amount of territory. But the cost was horrendous, and in every case, as Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has repeatedly pointed out, in every case, it has ended up with the Ukrainians being left weaker. And this counterattack in Kharkov region, I predict, will end in the same way. The Ukrainians will attack, the Russians will defeat them, they may give ground in one or two places, but it will be ephemeral gains for the Ukrainians. The Russians will then go on the attack, and we will probably see a further breakout by the Russians in Kharkov region. I think this is very much the Russian plan in Kharkov region. It is more consistent, and it makes better sense, to me at least, than the idea that the Russians would disperse their forces by launching an offensive, a further offensive, in Sumy region. Though, what do I know? And the Russians obviously don't share their secrets with me, as I've discussed many times. Now, we've been hearing less about HIMARS strikes on Belgorod over the last few hours. It may be that they've abated. There's some reports, by the way, that the Russians have destroyed a HIMARS launcher. I haven't seen those reports myself, or at least confirmation of those reports myself, but maybe they have. But anyway, one way or the other, it does look as if the Russians, for the moment at least, have contained the Ukrainian attacks upon themselves, the attacks with the HIMARS and the other systems. And of course, as I've discussed in previous programs, the HIMARS, as has been acknowledged in the US media itself, because of Russian jamming, is far less effective anyway on the battlefronts than it was when it was first introduced in the summer of 2022. There has been a very weird follow-up report yesterday about this whole situation, which says that Ukraine has been granted permission to use air defense missiles, Western supplied air defense missiles, to try to shoot down Russian aircraft over Russian territory. There's been quite a lot of commentary about this from the Russian side, and it expresses, the Russians are expressing complete incredulity. They're pointing out that this has always been the case. Ukraine has never hesitated, and in fact its Western backers have never hesitated in allowing or assisting Ukraine to use its Western supplied surface-to-air missiles in that kind of way. There's a Russian Telegram channel called Fighter Bomber, which appears to be connected with the Russian Air Force, or at least seems to be have good sources within the Russian Air Force. Fighter Bomber says that the Russian aircraft, the Russian aviation operating over Kharkov region has always had to deal with attempts by the Ukrainians to shoot down Russian aircraft over Russian territory, and that they've long learnt how to adjust and to cope with that. And in fact, I myself pointed out, I think a few other people have done so also, some months ago, there was an incident where a Russian Ilyushin 76 transport aircraft was shot down by the Ukrainians in the Belgorod area, whilst transporting Ukrainian prisoners of war. And it's widely accepted that this was done, I believe, using a Patriot missile system. Though, again, I say that from memory, and if people want to correct that and it was some other system, they're welcome to say. But anyway, the Ukrainians have repeatedly shown a readiness to use Western weapons, Western surface-to-air missiles, to try to shoot down Russian aircraft over Russian territory. And this announcement, in other words, changes nothing. And Fighter Bomber, this Telegram channel, also says that the Russians have tracked and have identified all of the various air defense systems that Ukraine used to have in Kharkov region, and that they've destroyed nearly all of them, which is why Kharkov city no longer has air defense to any degree. Other part of the reason why the Russians did that was because of the threat these systems posed to aircraft in Russia. So, again, it's difficult to understand the purpose of this announcement. As I said, it's provoked some measure of incredulity in Russia. The Western powers have just announced a shift in policy, simply confirming a policy that actually always existed and has never really been changed. On this subject, I would, however, add something further, which is that yesterday I mentioned that there were lots of rumours and reports and discussions that the Russians were going to respond to the to the Western decision to allow the Ukrainians to launch cross-border missile and other strikes using HIMARS rockets on Russian territory by taking steps to interfere with the work of US drones, US and NATO drones, and surveillance aircraft in the Black Sea. And I said that I thought it unlikely that the Russians would go all the way, for the moment at least, and seek to shoot those drones and those surveillance aircraft down. But I also suggested that the Russians might now start to make efforts to jam these drones and surveillance aircraft. And I said that the Russians would almost certainly not announce this, but that we might start to see things happen over the Black Sea, which might suggest that this change of policy by the Russians is now in effect. Well, possibly, just possibly, something like that happened last night. Now, it's all very confusing, and there might be multiple explanations of this, but it seems that a very powerful and advanced US surveillance drone, the Global Hawk, as well as various other surveillance drones, operated over the Black Sea last night. And then their transponders, which alert ground radars to their presence, were suddenly and mysteriously switched off. That led to rumours that all of these drones had been shot down, except that a few hours later, the transponders were then switched back on. There are some claims that in the case of one single drone, that failed to happen. And there are rumours, unconfirmed, completely unconfirmed, that that particular drone might have been brought down. Anyway, something even more strange then happened, because the Global Hawk, which had been flying fairly close to Crimea, then changed course and seemed to return to NATO territory. And then, after appearing to turn back and going back some distance, it then changed course again and started to operate over the Black Sea, but much closer to NATO territory, in other words, to the Turkish coast as opposed to the Crimean coast. Now, I think we must be very, very careful not to draw too many conclusions from this incident. There might be all sorts of explanations for it which we do not know. But it's possible, just possible, that these drones, including the Global Hawk, started to experience some level of interference by the Russians. That might have been what caused the controllers to switch the transponders off and then to pull the drones back towards NATO positions, the NATO coastlines in Romania specifically. And then it could be that there was a hurried discussion about what to do, and there might have been a decision made that it should not appear as if NATO was simply withdrawing completely from the Black Sea, and so a decision might have been made to redeploy the Global Hawk further away from the Crimea, well to the south, closer to the Turkish coast. In which case, if that is indeed what happened, and I want to stress this is all guesswork, nobody is confirming one way or the other. If that is indeed what happened, then it looks as if the Russians are indeed starting to undertake countermeasures against Western drones and surveillance aircraft operating over the Black Sea. Now, there's been an awful lot of discussion about the supposed success of the Ukrainians in their operations in the Black Sea against the Russian Black Sea Fleet. I made very clear my own belief that this success has been massively overstated, given the failure of the Ukrainians on every other front. But this incident perhaps demonstrates something else, which is that for the Ukrainians to achieve such success in this area as they have, they depend completely on data provided to them by the Western powers from their various surveillance systems over the Black Sea and in other places. Some of this data is, of course, provided by satellites, of which, of course, the United States and the other NATO countries have a substantial number. Some of it also is provided by AWACS aircraft and other surveillance aircraft, and a lot of it is provided by drones. Were there an out-and-out NATO-Russia war, the Russians, of course, would act immediately to destroy these surveillance systems. They probably do possess systems that could be used to destroy surveillance satellites, and, well, they probably wouldn't just jam drones, they would probably be shooting them down as well. In an out-and-out war, it would not be possible to reproduce the success, to the extent that it is a success, that has been taking place with the use of Western weapons in the Black Sea. The success that has taken place in the Black Sea has again been entirely the consequence of the remarkable self-restraint that the Russians have exercised over the Black Sea, as in so many other places, in that they have not reacted more aggressively to interfere with Western intelligence gathering. That has made those Ukrainian attacks possible. If that has changed, if the Russians are now prepared to act more aggressively than they did before, and intelligence gathering by the Western powers in the Black Sea is going to be restricted, then that, of course, could change the situation in the Black Sea very radically, and that might affect the situation in places like Odessa, for example. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. A Western green lighting of missile attacks on Russia, almost certainly now incentivizing Ukraine to conduct another hugely ill-conceived offensive in the Kharkov region, instead of doing what Ukraine really ought to be doing, which is to pull back to defendable lines and husband its forces and negotiate a peace instead. And if, as I said, the Russians are now taking steps to shut down the Western surveillance operation in the Black Sea, then, of course, it's a further big setback for Ukraine, which would more than make up for whatever ephemeral gains have been achieved through the launch of these blunted HIMARS missiles towards Belgorod. Anyway, that's the situation. That's the largest situation in the Kharkov region and on the various, and as between NATO and Russia at the moment. But of course, as I've discussed in many occasions, Kharkov region is only one theatre and far from the biggest in this war. Elsewhere on the line of contact, the Russians are continuing their offensive and are continuing to advance. Now, we've heard less from Chasiv Yar over the last 24 hours, which is completely unsurprising. As I said, reports don't always come through from every part of the battlefronts. The fact that we're getting fewer reports from the Chasiv Yar battlefronts in no way means that the fighting there has abated. Quite possibly the opposite is true. It looks as if the Russians, as I said previously, are now strongly entrenched west of the aqueduct, both to the north and south of Chasiv Yar, and it also looks as if the Russians are now in control of around a third to 2/5 of the micro-district to the east of the aqueduct. But everywhere else, we are getting all kinds of reports, and all of it is bad for Ukraine. There have been further Russian advances, or at least attacks on other villages in the Kupiansk area, east of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. I'm not going to spend an enormous amount of time discussing those attacks. Suffice to say that they're taking place and that the Russians now appear to be consolidating their positions in this area. Interestingly, yesterday there was a report that the Ukrainians are now starting to evacuate civilians from certain villages close to the town of Liman and from Liman itself. Liman, of course, lies to the west of the Zherebets River. It looks as if the Ukrainians are becoming concerned that once the Russians have cleaned up in these villages east of the Zherebets and Oskol rivers, they will cross those rivers and advance towards Liman again. And of course, Liman, one of the places Ukraine recaptured during its Kharkov 2022 counteroffensive. If the Russians capture Liman, then they're coming again very close to Slavyansk, the northern city in the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, which represents the last real line of defense Ukraine has in Donbass. And elsewhere, we're getting reports that the Russians are in the process of gaining more ground around Siversk itself, another small town actually located to the east of Liman. The Russians failed to capture it in 2022, but they seem to be making a much more concerted advance towards Siversk from multiple directions. And I suspect that once the Russians are ready, an attack on Siversk will come. It's a relatively small place, probably fairly well fortified now, but it is being bombed continuously, and it may be that the Ukrainians, with fewer troops to defend in Siversk, that they might find it more difficult now to hold out there for very long. So, a potential crisis for the Ukrainians in Siversk and conceivably in Liman as well. And the Russians have been conducting missile strikes on ETHEREUM, another place which they withdrew from during Ukraine's Kharkov 2022 offensive. Supposedly, there's a major Ukrainian headquarters now located in ETHEREUM. The fact that the Russians are launching missile strikes towards ETHEREUM and apparently also bombing Kupiansk itself suggests to me that eventually the Russians do intend to return to these places. Conceivably, once the Ukrainian offensive in Kharkov region has exhausted itself and the Russians go back on the attack and complete the capture of Volchansk, a major advance towards Kupiansk and Izium and Balakleya, and all of these places will take place. Siversk and Liman perhaps being scooped up as well, leaving the Russians maybe towards the end of this year or in the autumn in a very strong position indeed around Slavyansk again. We'll see. And in the meantime, we're getting lots of reports suggesting a continued slow motion collapse of Ukrainian defenses in the Avdiivka Ocheretino area. The Russians now control Netailovo, they control Urmansk. That Ukrainian defense line has collapsed. They're apparently making very significant advances within the village of Karlovka, which is part of the next and last viable defense line that the Ukrainians could create in this area. And they're also apparently making further advances in the village of Novo-Alexandrovka, further to the north. And in fact, I understand that the Ukrainians themselves are now saying to each other that the situation in this area is becoming increasingly critical and that they simply do not have the forces to hold the Russians back in this area where, after Avdiivka fell, the Russians punched this massive hole. And again, we don't know quite what the ultimate plans of the Russians are, but it does look as if they are working towards some kind of plan. It might be to pivot north towards Chasiv Yar and attack Ukrainian positions there from the south, even as the Russians are attacking Chasiv Yar from the east. We'll just have to see. And elsewhere, it seems that the long battle of Krasnogorovka is continuing in its somewhat desultory way. The Russians seem to be more focused on Netailovo and Karlovka at the moment than they are on Krasnogorovka. But there are also lots of reports further south that the Russians, now having effectively captured Paraskovievka, have now entered Konstantinovka, the village to the west of Paraskovievka. That will help them to advance, to take the various supply lines, to bring one of the roads leading to Vuglidar in the south under their control. And there are reports that the Russians are making further advances towards that same road, further south still. So, continued Russian advances all across the front lines, Ukraine short of men and machines in every part of the front lines, keeping their fingers crossed, hoping that in the autumn, when they eventually arrived, the F-16s are going to somehow change the situation. I don't believe they will. I think, on the contrary, by that time, the Russians will be even stronger than they are now. And I think that the Russian offensive will continue and will continue to gather pace. Again, I think people who are looking at these events from a distance, and especially people who are relying on the ISW to keep them informed about what is going on the battlefronts, have little real understanding of what is going on, of the extent to which Ukraine, its army on the front lines, is now being eroded away, of the terrible cost that aggressive attrition has now inflicted upon Ukraine. Some people do understand it. Alexei Arestovich, Zelensky's former spin doctor, has now come forward and has said that at absolute best, Ukraine might be able to hold out for a further 18 months, so that the final collapse might come at the end of 2025. But of course, by implication, that means that even Arestovich understands that there is a real possibility that the collapse might come a lot sooner than that. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, in a program that we did with him on the Duran on Monday, floated the possibility. He didn't make a prediction, but he floated the possibility based on the damage the Ukrainian army is currently absorbing, that it might not be able to hold together as long as November of this year, when, of course, the US presidential election is due to take place. And he also pointed out that when a collapse comes, the collapse can be sudden, there can be a rapid cascade with the fronts crumbling in multiple directions all at the same time. And I doubt, actually, I have to say this, I doubt that Western leaders, Western governments, Western officials, and certainly the Western commentariat are prepared for that very real possibility. Anyway, that's the overall situation today, speaking of today, in Ukraine. But we also have a lot of other things going on in the world. There have been elections in India. Prime Minister Modi has been re-elected, but with a smaller mandate than before. Instead of increasing his majority as he hoped, it has in fact been whittled away, and he will have to depend on coalition partners to maintain his position. I do not pretend to be an expert on Indian politics, but I suspect that in India, as in South Africa, the reason the ruling parties have lost ground is because, yes, they have been in power for a long time, and yes, some of their policies are controversial. But I think that, in fact, especially in India, despite all the undoubted economic success there has been, conditions of life for most people in India over the last few years have also become harder, and I think that that has turned them against the ruling party, as it often does. I think that has been true in South Africa as well. Notwithstanding that, the key point is that President Ramaphosa and Prime Minister Modi are still in power, and I don't get any sense that there is a general desire in either of these countries to change their geostrategic positions, either from the government side or from most of the opposition side, and I suspect that both countries will continue to remain fully committed to their current foreign policy courses and to the BRICS. And I've also, whilst talking about the BRICS, I've also seen reports, apparently they're not just reports, they're confirmed, that Turkey is now applying or thinking of applying for membership of the BRICS. And apparently several important countries within the BRICS, Russia first and foremost, have said that they welcome this Turkish intended application. And Turkey's reason for wanting to join the BRICS is because the option of joining the European Union has been closed off. And given that that is so, membership of the BRICS starts to make a lot of economic sense, which, by the way, it does. Now, Turkey, of course, is not yet a member of the European Union, though it does have an association agreement with the European Union. We would see whether or not that can survive, by the way, BRICS membership. But critically, and most importantly, Turkey is also a member of NATO. Now, in theory, membership of the BRICS, which is not an alliance, ought not to be incompatible with NATO membership. And I strongly suspect that that is the point that the Turks are going to make to the Americans and to others. I doubt very much that the Americans will accept this, regardless of which administration is in office next year if Turkey does indeed move to join the BRICS. In fact, I think that if Turkey moves into the BRICS, then one way or the other, it will put its NATO membership in question. Now, what exactly the West does about that, how NATO proceeds, is another matter. As far as I'm aware, there is no mechanism to expel a country from NATO once it has joined, so it's not clear to me exactly how Turkey could be ousted from NATO. But people who rely too much on that ought to remember that in the rules-based international order that we have today, the rules can be made and remade and adjusted and shifted as any particular situation requires, according to the wishes of certain states. And I am sure that a way to basically decant Turkey out of NATO, if that is the decision that is made, will be made. Now, were that to happen, it would be a geopolitical disaster for the United States and for NATO, comparable to the defeat, the pending defeat in Ukraine. In fact, the two are connected to each other. And by the way, if Turkey were to leave NATO and join the BRICS and become, well, not perhaps a formal ally of Russia, but at least some kind of strategic partner of Russia, which in theory, of course, it already is, and were that relationship to be consolidated, then nobody should be in any doubt that it will change the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. I am from that part of the world, and I can say with confidence that if the Russians secure their positions in Ukraine, win decisively the war in Ukraine, consolidate fully control of their great naval base in Sevastopol, which I'm sure they will, and have, in effect, open access to the Eastern Mediterranean through the Dardanelles. In theory, they have that already, of course, but the fact that Turkey is a NATO member state in practice means that in a confrontation with the West, up to now, Russia could not be confident that the Dardanelles would remain open in the event of a major crisis between Russia and the West. But if that situation were reversed, if the Russians could rely on Turkey to allow their ships to sail through the Dardanelles into the Eastern Mediterranean, then, given the extent of Russian power, we would start to see a major shift in the naval balance in the Eastern Mediterranean, especially now, given that the Russians are already positioned in Syria and, of course, have naval and air bases there. Now, that is all for the future. We're not there yet. Perhaps we will never get there. I can imagine that the West will do everything it possibly can to avoid getting into this position. And of course, we don't really know what Turkish intentions are. It would not surprise me at all if this proposal from Turkey that it join the BRICS is ultimately a negotiating ploy in order to extract more concessions from the Europeans and the Americans. Anybody who has followed President Erdogan's behavior in the past would know that that is quite likely so. But regardless, anybody is free to speculate. This is my region of the world. I can do so. It's possible that with a defeat in Ukraine and with Turkey realigning with the BRICS, the Western powers could be faced for the first time since the end of the Second World War with a genuine naval challenge in the Mediterranean, which has been, to all intents and purposes, a NATO and American lake ever since the 1940s. Just saying. So that's one interesting piece of news. Other interesting piece of news is that President Biden has now given an interview in which he has seemed to call into question Ukraine's prospects of becoming a NATO member state. He said that it's important not to dwell too much on the NATOization of Ukraine, a strange choice of words, and that the really important thing is preserving Ukraine's independence and sovereignty. Once upon a time, 5 years ago, I would have placed great weight on this statement from President Biden. Unfortunately, I no longer do. I think that President Biden, and indeed other US officials, can say things which do not mean what they appear to say. But anyway, it could be, these words could be an indicator that at some point, maybe after the election, if President Biden is indeed re-elected, some sort of effort to begin a negotiation process, as some speculate, might indeed happen. Though, as I said, this is a slender twig to place those hopes upon. And lastly, I have to say something about the utterly astonishing decision to prevent Scott Ritter boarding a plane and taking his passport away so as to prevent him from attending the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in Russia, one which apparently representatives of around 180 countries are going to attend. 180 countries. Well, all I can say about this is that it seems a petty-minded, petulant act by someone in the State Department. It's probably connected with the collapse, the slow-motion collapse of the peace conference in Switzerland, which is due to begin about 10 days from now. The US, Ukraine, furious that this peace conference idea in Switzerland is not attracting the important people that they expected, and that it looks like it's going to be a failure. And for some reason, they've taken out their anger against Scott Ritter for daring to attend or choosing to attend an alternative conference hosted by the Russians in St. Petersburg. These two conferences, the one in St. Petersburg and the one in Lucerne, are completely different. They have entirely different purposes. The St. Petersburg International Economic Forum takes place regularly every year. It is, or was, as I remember from when I attended it, last time I was there, by the way, was in 2016, so that's some way back now. But when I attended it, it was basically a place where business people met and did deals with each other, and where business people also were provided with an opportunity to discuss economic questions with relevant officials of the Russian government. All of the key people of the Russian government on the economic side would attend meetings and workshops, and they would explain Russian economic policy and Russian plans and intentions over the course of those meetings. Obviously, in the new tense strategic environment, things have changed, and perhaps it has more of a geopolitical purpose now than it did in those distant days when I attended it, but it's still hardly the same as the conference in Lucerne, ill-starred though that conference is, which was convened supposedly in order to cobble together a peace proposal, actually an ultimatum to be addressed to Russia over the conflict in Ukraine. And last but not least, I'm going to finish with President Biden's latest proposal for a ceasefire in Gaza. Now, so far as I could tell, this was essentially the same proposal that was floated some weeks ago and which was negotiated in Qatar, called for an Israeli ceasefire, eventual Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, release of hostages, release of prisoners, all of that kind of thing. It's a repackaged version of that ceasefire proposal. The Israelis categorically rejected it then, and it was certainty that the Israelis would reject it again this time. I am at something of a loss as to why President Biden proposed it at all. It seemed particularly strange to me that he would try to float this proposal and claim that it was an Israeli plan when it was clearly no such thing. But there we are, further evidence of the confusion of the foreign policy of the United States as the US government tackles intractable crises in Ukraine, in the Middle East, potentially in the Asia-Pacific region, with the prospect of being bested in all of them. I'm not going to devote more time to a discussion of the way in which US foreign policy has been conducted over the last few years. I've spoken about that at length. All I would say is that I advised President Biden, to the extent that I can, obviously, advice given on these podcasts is not going to, on these programs is not going to reach him. But anyway, I suggested way back in 2021 that he urgently needed to change his foreign policy team. We're now just a few months away from the November election, where in spite of everything he appears to be losing ground. The president didn't follow that advice. It's very late to follow it now, but I think he would still find that he would benefit if he did so. Well, this ends my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop where you can find all sorts of amazing things. We're doing also a series, several amazing items for Football 24, which is coming up, and there's a discount which you can get if you want to become the owner of these attractive items. And last but not least, remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.